On behalf of Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors, the David Horowitz Center, and Jewish Current Issues, I welcome everyone to hear the renowned author Norman Podhoretz speak on his new book, Why Are Jews Liberals? This is such a provocative and timely topic, and we expect a very interesting evening. I'm Doris Wise-Montrose, and I'm president of Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors. I would like to make a special mention of a few people with us tonight in the audience. Oscar and Emmy Award nominated filmmaker and recognized by Yad Vashem Lionel Chetwin. Larry Greenfield, former director of the RJC and now fellow at the Claremont Institute. Film star, singer, and major Jewish activist Ed Ames. Roger L. Simon, author and award-winning screenwriter and co-founder and CEO of Pajamas Media and Pajamas TV. Harvey Schechter, former executive director of the Anti-Defamation League. Who I was his secretary when I was 20 years old, about 10 years ago. Stephen Shub, the actor who portrayed Peter Bergson in the play The Accomplices. Satirist, political commentator, and writer Evan Sayet. It has been an honor and a pleasure to work with the David Horowitz Freedom Center and Jewish Current Issues. Our organizations, either individually or in co-sponsorship, have very exciting and important events and speakers coming up that you should not miss. I now have the honor of introducing to you Rick Richmond of Jewish Current Issues, an extraordinary blogger and contributor to the Jewish Press, American Thinker, Jewish Journal, the New York Sun, the Contentions blog, and Commentary magazine. Rick's posts and articles are always highly analytical and meticulously discerning based on original sources and texts. He manages to address current events with clarity as well as heart and even a wry sense of humor not found in the mainstream. Thank you all for coming.
Let me start by thanking Doris and her colleagues for their extraordinary efforts in arranging this evening. She has almost single-handedly turned Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors into the forum in Los Angeles where some of the most important American and Israeli and indeed international speakers come to meet the community, and tonight is obviously no exception. Doris thought I could probably handle the task of introducing someone who needs no introduction, who in turn would introduce someone who needs no introduction either. But since I am quite sure that everyone in this audience knows who David Horowitz is, I think in the interest of time I'm going to restrict myself to a single anecdote, which I hope will say something simultaneously about both David Horowitz and Norman Podhoretz. Earlier this year, John Fleischhauer, who is the editor of Spiegel in Germany, published an article entitled How to Become an Accidental Conservative. It was a humorous article with a serious undertow, along the lines of Harry Stein's How I Accidentally Joined the Vast Right-Wing Conspiracy, describing how Fleischhauer had become a conservative much to his own surprise after spending most of his life in virtually exclusive company of liberals. In the business of opinions, he wrote, where I currently earn my money, there is practically nothing but leftists, and anyone who is not is well advised to keep it to himself. No one wants to be the only person in an office who isn't asked to join the group for lunch. It's an interesting article, but it is not really its substance that causes me to mention it to you this evening. It is rather the subtitle that Fleischhauer gave it, which was Breaking Ranks. When I saw that subtitle, it occurred to me that breaking ranks is not quite the right description for simply opening oneself up to the alternative sources of information and opinion that are so widely available these days. Breaking ranks is what Norman Podhoretz and David Horowitz did 3 or 4 decades ago. It is, in fact, the title of one of Norman Podhoretz's early books. And anyone who has read that book, or David Horowitz's extraordinary autobiography, Radical Son, knows that breaking ranks back then was not a gently humorous, accidental process, but an act of huge intellectual courage, and perhaps even greater social courage. Norman wrote an entire book about the prominent ex-friends his intellectual integrity cost him. In David's case, given the nature of one of the radical groups he decided to leave, physical courage was required as well. So this evening would not have happened but for the indefatigable efforts of Doris Wise Montrose and her group. But both she and I know that the real thanks for this evening and making it possible goes to Norman Podhoretz for writing an extraordinary book based on a lifetime of erudition and experience, and to the similar efforts of a lifetime by a person who it is now my privilege to call to the stage to introduce him, David Horowitz.
Thank you. It is a very special pleasure that I have tonight of introducing my friend, Norman Podhoretz. Actually, it's 2 pleasures. The first is his new book, which brings us here tonight. Why are Jews liberals? Why indeed? The tide of anti-Semitism and public Jew hatred, which is sweeping the world today, is greater and more alarming than anything I have witnessed in my lifetime. This hatred comes from Islam and the political left. Its willing appeasers and apologists are liberals. The greatest defenders of the Jews in Israel are conservatives and American Christians. Yet American Jews continue to be overwhelmingly aligned with the political left. A greater percentage of gay Americans vote for Republicans. These troubling observations account for the fact that every time a conservative Jew like myself appears on a public platform, the first question from the audience is likely to be, why are Jews liberals? So I am personally thrilled that Norman has written this book. Because I don't have the answer. Now I'll say, read Norman's book. The second source of my pleasure is the fact that Norman has been a mentor and an example to me, as he has been for so many others engaged in the defense of the West and its freedoms. And this is the real reason why we have come out tonight. Commentary, the magazine which Norman edited and put his stamp on for 35 years, has published a symposium about this new book, whose introduction describes him as a lion of disputation. It is one time, if I may say so, the commentary has fallen short of the mark. Oh, Norman is good at disputation, that's for sure, and we can all learn from him how to do it. But intellectual exercises are not what Norman has been about. Norman's life has been more akin to that of a soldier in a great war, who found himself at an early age on the front lines of the battlefields, and has never considered abandoning his post, not even in his 80th year. Norman discovered this war when he was drafted into the American Army to fight against communist totalitarianism, and found that as a Jew and as an American, he was really fighting the same fight. His books, which are no doubt disputations, can only be understood in the context of the battles in this war, which is a war for individual liberty, for the freedoms that Jews sought for nearly 2,000 years and that Americans established on this continent 250 years ago. Ever since their creation at the end of the 18th century, the liberal democracies of the West have been under attack from the political left and right. In the modern era, it is the socialist left which has spearheaded these attacks, first in the form of communist totalitarianism, and today as a radical international which is anti-globalization, anti-Israel, and anti-the United States. It is in defense of America, Israel, and the West that Norman Podhoretz has dedicated his life and his work. Norman's book, Why We Are in Vietnam, is the most articulate and eloquent justification for and explanation of America's war against the communists in Southeast Asia that anybody has written. His memoir, Breaking Ranks, is a disputation with American liberals who defected from the cause of individual freedom, America, and Israel in the 1960s and 70s. Norman's editorship of Commentary transformed that magazine into the clearest and most important voice, keeping America on course through the Cold War with Soviet totalitarianism. His book, World War IV, is a clarion call to Americans to arm themselves against Islamic totalitarianism, the newest threat to freedom, to Israel and America. Norman's most recent memoir is called, appropriately, My Love Affair with America, and is an account of his life on these battlefields, his discovery of his country, and his war with its enemies. The new book, Why Jews Are Liberals, reviews 2,000 years of Jewish history to explain how many Jews, once emancipated, joined the political culture of the left. Like everything Norman writes, this book is not only a description, it is also a disputation with those enemies of America and the Jews, and with the well-meaning fellow travelers who should and need to know better. So the life that Norman has pursued does include contentious arguments, but the burden he has shouldered is a much heavier than such terms would suggest. The gravity and persistence and brilliance with which he has borne this burden, defending his country and his people, has put all, Americans and Jews, deeply and gratefully in his debt.
Wow. You know, the trouble with an introduction like that is that it becomes in itself a tough act to follow. And needless to say, I was overwhelmed by it. I love, in any case, being introduced in flattering terms, not just because it tickles my vanity, but because it gives me an opportunity to segue naturally into one of my favorite Jewish jokes. It's a joke with an unlikely venue. It's the deathbed of a Hasidic Rebbe who was surrounded by his disciples, and they're weeping and wailing and bemoaning the imminent loss of their teacher and guide. And one of them says, "Oh, woe is us. How will we survive the death of our Rebbe? He is the wisest man of the age, and who will set us an example of wisdom when he is gone?" And another said, "How will we survive the death of our Rebbe? He's the most learned man of the age, and who will teach us Torah when he is gone?" And the third said, "How will we survive the death of our Rebbe? He's the most ethical man of the age, and who will set us an example of ethical conduct when he is gone?" And they wept and they tore their clothes, and the old man, with the last ounce of strength in his failing body, raises himself on his elbow and says, "And about my humility you have nothing to say?" David had nothing to say about my humility, for which I am famous on at least 2 continents. I hope you enjoyed that laugh. You're not going to get too many laughs out of me from now on. Now, I've often said, and I say again in this book, that never have I been asked any question on any subject as many times as I've been asked why most Jews are liberals, or in its more specifically political form, why most Jews keep voting for the Democrats. But this question immediately gives rise to another question. which is why so many people, and especially non-Jews, are so puzzled by the political attitudes and behavior that predominate among American Jews. After all, up until the end of World War II, no one would have wondered why most American Jews were liberals or why they were so committed to the Democratic Party. The answer would have been self-evident. In those days, most American Jews were poor, and this meant that the Democratic Party, which spoke for the interests of people in their socioeconomic condition, was their natural political home. In those days, too, Jews suffered from various forms of discrimination, and this made it inevitable that they would look upon liberal ideas as being good for them. This indeed had been the case for centuries. The ancestors, both immediate and distant, of the vast majority of American Jews had lived in Europe, where the forces that favored the emancipation of the Jews and the granting of civil rights and liberties to them had always been located somewhere on the left. And in 20th century America, especially after the ascension of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the closest counterpart to these forces seemed to be the Democratic Party. Conversely, the political right seemed to represent an American version of the conservative forces in Europe, which had always opposed equal rights for Jews. It made perfect sense, then, for Jews to align themselves with the left and to keep their distance from the right, where they were in any case unwelcome. But then something momentous happened that began to rob these political commitments of the sense they had always made. This momentous event was the Six-Day War of 1967. Now, to be sure, even before 1967, in the decades following the end of World War II, Jews found themselves getting more and more out of political step with the other white members of the Roosevelt coalition. The attachment of these non-Jewish ethno-religious groups to the Democrats was steadily declining in direct proportion to the improvement in their economic and social condition, but not the Jews, a substantial majority of whom kept on voting for the Democratic candidate in every presidential election. It was this phenomenon that gave rise to Milton Himmelfarb's deservedly famous epigram, "Jews earn like Episcopalians," he said in the 1950s, when the Episcopalians were the richest of American ethno-religious groups. And he went on, "They vote like Puerto Ricans," who were then the poorest of the ethno-religious groups. In short, by 1967, the Jewish commitment to the Democratic Party was already an anomaly from a socio-economic point of view. And so far as discrimination was concerned, most of the barriers against Jews had already been toppled. The principle that was responsible for this development was the belief that justice required individuals to be treated on their own merits as individuals, without regard, as the old liberal catechism we used to recite as kids in school, without regard to race, color, creed, or country of national origin. But by 1967, this formerly sacred liberal principle was giving way among liberals to a new conception of social justice that entailed the reintroduction of the kind of quota system that had always been used as a way of keeping Jews out and down. And then came the Six-Day War. In the weeks leading up to it, President Nasser of Egypt and the leaders of the other Arab countries bordering Israel issued a steady stream of blood-curdling threats to destroy Israel and drive its Jewish inhabitants, as Nasser put it, into the sea. Thus, for the second time in the 20th century, and only a quarter of a century after the first, a major community of Jews was threatened with annihilation, actual annihilation. And once again, the world, as it seemed, stood complacently by. The difference, the literally earth-shaking difference, was that this time, the Jews living under a genocidal threat had the means and the will to defend themselves against it. And so the Israelis did. In 6 short days, they averted another Holocaust by waging one of the most brilliant campaigns in military history. Most American Jews quite naturally celebrated that victory. But on the left, and especially among the intellectuals who made their political home there, the outcome of the Six-Day War gave anything but cause for celebration. On the contrary, the Israeli victory became the occasion for an outbreak of what called itself anti-Zionism, but that was more often than not the cover for a new species of anti-Semitism through which the hatred that had from time immemorial been directed at the Jewish people was now directed at the Jewish state. In the process, the libelous charges that anti-Semites had always hurled at Jews living in the diaspora was being translated into the language of international affairs and applied to the Israelis. Now, when some of us sounded the alarm over this ominous development, we were accused of trying to fend off any criticism of Israel's policies by smearing it as anti-Semitism. This ploy is still being used. But as the years have passed, and as the new anti-Zionism has spread like a metastasizing malignancy through the major institutions of the liberal culture, the universities, the mainstream media, the world of the arts and entertainment, not to mention the UN, it has become harder and harder to maintain the pretense that there's any significant difference between the new anti-Zionism and the old anti-Semitism. And so it came about that the political left, which had for so long and with good reason commanded the loyalty of the Jews, was now offering hospitality to ideas and sentiments that were blatantly hostile to Jews. To cite only one of the many examples I discuss in my book, The Nation, perhaps the most influential magazine of the American left, and that had once upon a time been a staunch supporter of Israel, could now publish an article by Gore Vidal in which Israel was described, and I'm quoting his words, as a predatory nation busy stealing other people's land in the name of an alien theocracy, and in which American Jews were denounced as, and again in Vidal's words, all American Jews, as an Israeli fifth column. That was bad enough that a major liberal periodical could play host to this naked invocation of two of the classic themes of anti-Semitism, the Jew as a disloyal alien and the Jew as a conspiratorial manipulator of malign power, dangerous to everyone else. But what was even worse was that Vidal's article elicited no more than a weak peep of protest from the magazine's sponsors and readers. The Vidal affair provided powerful confirmation for the argument some of us had been making since 1967 that anti-Semitism had found a new home on the left. And then, by a lucky coincidence, the Nation's opposite number on the right, National Review, became embroiled in a similar controversy of its own that provided commensurately powerful evidence for the argument we had also been making since 1967, that anti-Semitism was become more and more unwelcome among conservatives. This controversy involved a member of National Review's editorial staff named Joseph Sobran, who had devoted a number of his syndicated columns to attacking not just the State of Israel, but also the Jewish people in general, and Judaism as a religion. Accordingly, a letter of protest was sent to a long list of prominent conservative intellectuals connected with National Review. And in sharp contrast to the liberal intellectuals connected with the Nation, to whom a similar letter had been sent, all the conservatives joined in expressing outrage at Sobran's anti-Semitic writings. And in spite of the fact that none of the clearly anti-Semitic pieces of Sobran had appeared in National Review itself, the letter was also sent to its editor, William F. Buckley, Jr. But whereas Victor Navasky, the editor of The Nation, had responded to a similar letter denying that the Vidal piece was anti-Semitic or even anti-Israel, Buckley wrote an editorial dissociating his magazine from Sobran on this issue and admonishing him to begin respecting, quote, the welcome structure of taboos concerning Israel and the Jews. Now, what emerged from this dramatic contrast between the two cases was further evidence that anti-Semitism had largely, if not, as the name of Pat Buchanan reminds us, not entirely been banished from its traditional home on the right, while especially in the guise of anti-Zionism, it was meeting with more and more toleration and sometimes even approval on the left. This momentous reversal also manifested itself in the bitter debates over other issues of Jewish interest and concern, such as quotas and the plight of Soviet Jewry that I analyze in detail in my book. But it was and is in Christian attitudes toward Israel that the reversal of roles between left and right has been most saliently manifested, and thereby hangs a tale. Although there appears to have been some slippage in the intensity of Jewish concern for Israel, most American Jews, including most of the liberals among them, still care deeply about the security of Israel. And as everyone knows, or should know by now, there is no group in America, probably not even the Jews themselves, which sides more passionately with Israel in the war being waged against it by the Arab Muslim world, and which is more steadfast in upholding Israel's right to defend itself against its sworn enemies than the so-called religious right. Yet instead of forging a political... I didn't get a hand like that in New York when I said this. Very heartening. Yet instead of forging a political alliance with this community, Jewish liberals look for ways to justify their refusal to do so. At the same time, they're perfectly willing to make common cause with the so-called mainline Protestant denominations, despite the fact that unfriendliness and even outright hostility to Israel have become pervasive in that sector of the Christian world. A similar situation exists in the strictly political realm. All the poll data show self-described conservatives and Republicans sympathizing with Israel in much greater proportions than self-described liberals and Democrats. For example, in a Pew survey taken early this year, 60% of conservatives sided with Israel as against only 8% with the Palestinians, whereas the comparable numbers among self-described liberals were only about half as much for Israel, 33%, as opposed to 60%, but nearly 3 times as much, 21%, as opposed to 8% for the Palestinians. The same pattern shows up in terms of party affiliation, where 69% of Republicans express more sympathy for Israel than for the Palestinians, while only 42% of Democrats do, a gap of 27 points. Nevertheless, the average Jewish vote for Democratic presidential candidates, an amazing 75%, has remained what it was between 1928 and the Great Refusal of 1967, Great Reversal, of 1967, and it's still far higher than that of any other group. And when I say still, I most emphatically include 2008. Running against John McCain, Barack Obama captured 78% of the Jewish vote. Now get a load of these numbers. It was the 78% was 25 points higher than the 53% he scored with the electorate as a whole, 35 points higher than the pro-Obama white vote in general, and even 11 points higher than his Hispanic vote. Broken down by religion, the Jewish vote for Obama was 33 points higher than the Protestant vote and 24 points higher than the Catholic vote for him. Only with blacks, who gave him 95% of their vote, did Obama do better than he did with the Jews. And so it continues to go with the liberal agenda. On the older economic and political issues like government spending, benefits to the poor, and organized labor, as well as on the newer issues that form the battlefields of the culture war, abortion, gay marriage, school prayer, assisted suicide, gun control, and so on, the polls consistently show huge gaps between Jews and all other Americans, with Jews supporting these causes in far greater numbers and proportions than any other group, whether defined ethnically, whether defined religiously, whether defined demographically in terms of income or social position and status. Which brings me finally to the question I wrote my book to answer. Why are Jews so stubbornly committed to whatever happens to be on the liberal agenda at any given moment? And why have they continued voting for Democrats in spite of the changes that have taken place since 1967, both in their socioeconomic position and in the Democratic Party itself, that might have been expected to drive them away? Many attempts have been made to account for this anomalous phenomenon, and they fall into three large categories: historical, sociological, and religious. Those who favor the historical explanation tell us that Jews have long memories and that they are therefore still mindful of the centuries of oppression their people suffered at the hands of the right, as against the help they were given by the forces of the left. In my judgment, however, to the extent that the historical explanation is valid, it's a case that resembles the guns of Singapore. As some of you may remember, before the outbreak of World War II, these artillery pieces were pointed in the direction from which the island had last been invaded, and so they proved utterly useless against the Japanese, who simply invaded from the other side. For the Jews, the enemy had always been on the right, and it was from there that he had only yesterday launched the most murderous assault on them in their long history. It may be understandable that they would keep looking for the enemy where he was last seen, but as the British discovered in 1940 from the guns of Singapore, fighting the last war can only bring defeat in the new war that has just broken out. The sociological factors that are often invoked include minority status, education, parental influence, the greater degree of comfort Jews feel in the company of the kind of people who belong to the Democratic Party, the fear of being punished socially for dissenting from the political orthodoxies of the community, and even lately, genetic inheritance. Apparently, there's a new theory that Gilbert and Sullivan were right when they wrote every little boy and every little girl born into this world alive is either a little liberal or else a little conservative. There are serious proponents of this theory. Well, I was talking about the sociological. Not surprisingly, I'm still with the sociological theory. The most original explanation is found in an article by Irving Kristol, where, with his usual boldness, he proposes that Jews, though notorious for their intelligence, are actually stupid when it comes to politics. The title of that article, incidentally, I'm going to digress for a minute, is The Political Stupidity of American Jews, and it begins with an anecdote which is one of my own favorites as well. It seems that when Saul Bellow, the great Nobel Prize-winning novelist, was a teenager at the University of Chicago, he and a group of his friends, all brilliant young Jewish kids like Isaac Rosenfeld, he used to hang around in Bellows' aunt's kitchen, which was located not too far from the university, where they would argue. They were mostly Trotskyites, and they would argue, for hours about Stalinism, Trotskyism, the revolution, not the revolution. And one day, Bellows' aunt looked at them all sadly and said, "Smart, smart, smart, stupid." Okay. But the most popular explanation by far traces liberalism, Jewish liberalism, all the way back to the Jewish values that are said to derive from the commandments of Judaism, or more broadly, the spirit of the Jewish religious tradition. There is, however, a fatal flaw at the heart of the theory that the liberalism of American Jews stems from the teachings of Judaism. If the theory were valid, the Orthodox would be the most liberal sector of the Jewish community. For, after all, it's they who are the most familiar with the Jewish religious tradition, who are the most deeply influenced by its holy books, and whose lives are most fully shaped by its commandments. Yet, the Orthodox are the least liberal of all their fellow Jews. The Orthodox enclaves... Are you applauding me or the Orthodox? The Orthodox enclaves are the only Jewish neighborhoods where conservative candidates get any votes to speak of. Even more telling is that on every one of the issues involved in the culture war, the Orthodox oppose the politically correct liberal positions taken passionately by most other American Jews. And they oppose them precisely because these positions conflict with Jewish law. To take only a few examples, Jewish law permits abortion only to protect the life of the mother. It forbids sex between men, and it prohibits suicide except when the only alternatives are forced conversion and incest, and so on. I have much more to say in my book about why the religious theory, as commonly expounded, fails to explain the continuing commitment of American Jews to liberalism. I also analyze each one of the other theories before concluding that they're all either inadequate or just plain wrong. I do, however, go on to argue that there's another way of framing the religious theory that does lead us to an answer to the question. It is that liberalism has become much, much more than a political position to most American Jews. It has, in fact, become a religion in its own right. A religion complete with its own Torah and its own set of commandments. Through a process I describe at length in the book, this new Torah, the Torah of liberalism as I call it, has superseded the Torah of Judaism to the point where we can say without exaggeration that liberalism, not Judaism, is now the religion of most American Jews. Now, I do not go as far in my book as the cruel wit who once described the services in a Reform temple. This is a non-Jew who went to a bar mitzvah of the kid of a friend of his, and came back and said the services there were like the Democratic Party at prayer. Another cruel wit described Reform Judaism in general as the Democratic Party platform with holidays thrown in. I think that's wicked, but it's funny. But I do contend that many American Jews sincerely believe that adhering to the Torah of liberalism makes them good Jews, even though in any conflict between the new Torah and the old, the new always trumps the old. To this new Torah, its adherents give the same measure of steadfast devotion and scrupulous obedience that their forebears, their grandfathers and great-grandfathers, gave to the Torah of Judaism. So too, They regard moving from left to right or from liberalism to conservatism with the same horror that their forebears felt at conversion to Christianity. Of course, when I speak of the conflict between left and right or between liberals and conservatives, I'm talking about a divide much wider than the conflict between Democrats and Republicans and much deeper than electoral politics. What the great issue between the two political communities fundamentally turns on is how they feel about the nature of American society. With all exceptions duly noted, I think it's fair to say that what the left mainly sees when it looks at America is injustice and oppression of every kind, economic, social, and political. By sharp contrast, the right sees a complex of traditions, principles, and institutions that have made it possible for more freedom and, even factoring in periodic economic downturns, more prosperity to be enjoyed by more of its citizens than in any society known to human history. It follows that what liberals believe needs to be changed or discarded, not to mention apologized for to other nations, is precisely what conservatives are dedicated to preserving, reinvigorating, and proudly defending against attack. In this realm, too, American Jewry surely belongs with the conservatives rather than the liberals. For the social, political... Why? Because the social, political, and moral system that liberals wish to transform is the very system in and through which Jews found a home such as they had never discovered in all their forced wanderings throughout the centuries over the face of the earth. The Jewish immigrants who began coming here from East Europe in the 1880s were right to call America the Golden Medina, the Golden Land. There was no gold in the streets, as some of them may actually have imagined, and so they had to struggle and struggle hard. But there was another kind of gold in America, a more precious kind than the gold of coins. There was freedom and there was opportunity. Blessed with these conditions and hampered by much less disabling forms of anti-Semitism and discrimination than Jews had previously grown accustomed to contending with, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of these immigrants flourished, and not just in material terms, to an extent unprecedented in the history of their people. What I'm saying is that the Jewish experience in this country bears eloquent testimony to the infinitely precious virtues of the traditional American system. Surely then, we Jews have an obligation to join with its defenders against those who are blind or indifferent or antagonistic to the philosophical principles, the moral values, and the socioeconomic institutions on whose health and vitality the traditional American system depends. In 2008, we were faced with a candidate who explicitly ran on the premise that the traditional American system was seriously flawed and in desperate need of radical change. As he said on October 31, 2008, "We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America." And he also had a record powerfully indicating that he would pursue policies dangerous to the security of Israel. Because of all this, I hoped for a while that my fellow Jews would finally break free of the liberalism to which they have remained in thrall, long past the point where it has served either their interests or their ideals, whether as Jews or as Americans. That hope having been so resoundingly dashed, I now grasp for a bit of encouragement from the signs that buyer's remorse may be beginning to set in among Jews. As buyer's remorse also seems to be setting in among independents who voted for Obama. And so, I am now hoping against hope that the exposure of Obama as a false messiah, a kind of non-Jewish Shabtai Tzvi, will at last open the eyes of my fellow Jews to the correlative falsity of the political creed that he so perfectly personifies, and to which so many of them have for so long been so misguidedly loyal. Thank you very much. I ought to visit Los Angeles more often. It would be good for my declining morale.
This is a Los Angeles Hollywood question for you. What role has the media and Hollywood played in keeping the Jews liberal?
Well, it's sort of circular because so many members of the media and Hollywood are Jewish themselves. So to the extent that they are helping to keep Jews liberal, they're helping to keep Jews like themselves. I mean, the answer is to a considerable extent. You know, there's this trickle-down theory of economics that most liberals sneer at, but they do believe in the trickle-down theory of political attitudes, a kind of cultural trickle-down. And there's no question that the attitudes that that I've been attacking here are represented in full flower in the entertainment industry and in the mainstream media. And it's almost unnecessary to be aware of what's happening as you are exposed to them, as sort of trickle by trickle, drop by drop. These attitudes get absorbed into the bloodstream. So, and it's not just Jews that the media and the and the entertainment industry are influencing in this direction. It's everyone who is exposed, and that means everyone. And unless the audience, at least half of this country, does have good reasons to resist, they're likely to be pushed in the direction of liberalism.
Why are so many American Jewish women opposed to Sarah Palin?
Well, let me begin by being more specific about something I touched on in my talk. Most American women, something in the order of 75%, are in favor of choice, in favor of abortion on demand, actually. Jewish women are off the charts. It's like 99% of Jewish women are in favor of this. Now, you ask yourself, why? I mean, what, quite apart from the merits of the issue, how is it that virtually 100% of Jewish women support this position as against a much lower number of Americans in general? I mean, I have sometimes imagined that liberal Jews, not just women, think that when Moses came down from Sinai with the 2 tablets, on one was written abortion on demand and on the other was written gay marriage. Those are 2 of the principal mitzvot, commandments of the Torah of liberalism. it is a bit of a puzzle, but it's just one aspect of the larger question of why American Jews are so persistently liberal. And by the way, I think there are some studies that indicate that the proportion of Jews who are liberal is raised by Jewish women. I mean, that is to say, more Jewish women are liberal than Jewish men. So when you talk about 75%, it might be a little lower if you were separating out the men. I don't know if that's actually true, but there is some evidence to that effect. And I don't suppose I've answered the question, but...
Please comment on the influence, motivations, and danger of J Street.
Well, J Street is the latest incarnation or iteration of a movement that's been active at least since 1967. That is, Jews who have joined see themselves as critics of certain policies of Israel, but who've actually taken positions that are quite demonstrably contrary to the interests of Israel and threatening to the safety and security of Israel. There was Breira at one point. There was Americans for Peace Now. There have been others such. There was Tikkun movement that organized itself around that so-called magazine. And J Street is the latest, as I say, incarnation of that movement. My view is that, first of all, that this movement, despite the fact that most American Jews are liberals, this movement has had not much more than 15% of the Jewish community behind it. And its importance, every time one of these movements come along, it gets written about in the press, it gets celebrated, because a lot of the enemies of Israel like Jewish cover for their ideas, and if they can hide behind an avowedly Jewish organization, it makes it easier for them to attack Israel without being accused of being anti-Semitic. So they serve that particular function. I think that J Street has gotten an inordinate amount of attention for the same reason, and because, of course, the Obama administration has an interest in promoting it, so that they were invited to this meeting of Jewish leaders with the president, whereas the ZOA was not invited. I'm loath to speculate on their motivations, but I'm willing to talk about the consequences of their actions. And the consequences of their actions have been to weaken support for Israel in this country, and it's especially dangerous at this moment when Israel is more isolated diplomatically than perhaps it has ever been. And by the way, the head of J Street just the other day described his organization as running something like being a running fullback or running the defensive back for the Obama administration, running interference for the Obama administration. So he said it, I didn't say it. And I think that this is an organization that cares more about supporting the effort of the Obama administration to transform both the domestic character of this country and its role in international affairs, and particularly with respect to Israel. Support that more than it cares about anything else, including the security and safety of Israel. By the way, they were almost the only group, that certainly even among liberal Jews, that said Israel had no right to retaliate in Gaza against the relentless bombing of Sderot. Gives you some idea of what kind of people they are.
There do not seem to be any liberals left in the Democratic Party. They've all become progressives. Liberals such as JFK, Scoop Jackson, Pat Moynihan, and Joe Lieberman, all are either gone or unwelcome. Such people may not be comfortable, however, joining the Republican Party. Do you think there are any prospects for a third party that would be neither progressive nor conservative, but classically liberal? And wouldn't that be the best place for Jews?
Well, third parties don't work in America, and there are a lot of reasons why they don't work. And I don't think that I don't think that much good would come of an effort to found such a party. Besides which, they wouldn't get many members. I remember we were just talking this evening about the 1980 election. 1980 was the only occasion on which a Democratic candidate for president failed to get a majority of the Jewish vote. He got a plurality. That was Jimmy Carter running against Reagan for re-election. Now, there was a man named John Anderson running as an independent third-party candidate in that race, and the only function that John Anderson finally wound up serving was to make it possible for the Jews who couldn't bring themselves to vote for Carter, but who would die before they would vote for Reagan, to vote for somebody else. So he got 19% of the vote, and I suspect that all those votes, 99% of those votes, were from Jews. What are you going to do?
You recognize that most Jews, including most Jewish liberals, support Israel. And therefore most Jewish supporters of Obama. Barack Obama has Jewish advisors in the highest positions in the White House. He has a longtime supporter of Israel as Secretary of State. His czar for Pakistan and Afghanistan is Jewish, as is his czar for Iran, Dennis Ross. Why wouldn't you say that Jewish influence is at an all-time historic high?
Well, the Jews can easily live without such Jewish influence. Dick Holbrooke is the czar for Afghanistan and Pakistan. I know Dick Holbrooke very well. I've known him for 45 years. I discovered some years ago one day from reading in the paper when he was ambassador to Germany that he had a Seder, and it turned out that he was Jewish. And I'd known him by that time for something like 35, 40, and I didn't know he was Jewish. So the next time I saw him, I said, "How come you never told me you were Jewish?" And he said, "You never asked," which is true. It never occurred to me. But by the way, he's the least bad of that crew, politically. I mean, Dennis Ross has been another interesting character. He's done everything in his power when he's been serving in some official capacity in either Republican or Democratic administrations. Done everything in his power to promote Arafat, to promote the PLO, all, because he believed it was ultimately in the best interest of Israel, so he said. He even once, I think this is a true story, as a bar mitzvah gift to his son, he arranged for a congratulatory call from Yasser Arafat. Okay, I can't banish the memory of this kiss she planted on the cheek of Mrs. Arafat once in New York. But she's another story, by compared with everybody else in the Obama administration. Of course, she's just, she might as well be, Ben Gurion. We go down the list. Axelrod and Rahm Emanuel. We were all told Rahm Emanuel is an Israeli. He was in the IDF. His father belonged to the Irgun. All this may be true, but the fact of the matter is that whether it's true or not, Rahm Emanuel I regard as an enemy of Israel, and David Axelrod certainly. So if the Obama administration was staffed by some fundamentalist Protestants, the Jews would be better off than having those Jews involved.
How does tikkun olam, or repairing the world, relate to liberalism, and isn't that the 614th commandment?
Well, there are two parts to that. The tikkun olam is a concept that originated in the Kabbalistic writings of the Ari, the supposed author or co-author of the Zohar. And what it meant, what it should properly be used to mean, is the idea that whenever a Jew performs a mitzvah, observes a commandment, he brings the messianic redemption a little bit closer. And there's a whole cosmology behind this, which is fascinating about, I don't no time to go into it, but so that tikkun olam actually was, properly understood, a concept urging Jews to observe the commandments. And when you see Lubavitcher Hasidim running around in mitzvah mobile, and they stop people, say, "Are you Jewish?" And give them tefillin, they show them how to put on tefillin. And they actually believe that if they can get this Jew, David Horowitz, say, to put on tefillin, that this will bring the Messiah a little bit closer. That concept was kidnapped by a bunch of leftists, Jewish leftists in the 60s, to mean, and they interpret it to mean repair of the world is what it literally means, tikkun olam, repair of the world. And they identify it entirely with the liberal agenda. I mean, I'm serious. It's, they list the things that tikkun olam means in some of their writings, and it turns out that tikkun olam means supporting every program that the Democrats happen to be pushing at that moment. It's true. And as for the 614th commandment, so it's a total distortion and misrepresentation of a Jewish concept, and it's used for various reasons that I actually discuss at some length in my book. You really have to read the book to there are Jews who, that is radicals, there are radicals or liberals who believe in the Torah of liberalism, who for one reason or another want a Jewish imprimatur, or hechsher, as you might properly say, on their political views. And so it's very convenient for them to dig up ideas or concepts and try to claim that Judaism supports their political agenda. As for the 614th commandment, that particularly bothers me because I was, the secret can now come out, I was one of the authors of that idea when I worked on an article for commentary with the late Emil Fackenheim. And Emil Fackenheim's idea was that out of Auschwitz had come a new commandment, and the commandment was, we must not give posthumous victories to Hitler. And in other words, there shall be Jews, and Jews must do everything in their power to live, and so as not to give posthumous victories. And that's what I actually, as an editor, you sometimes insert things into manuscripts, and I actually inserted that idea. It was his idea, basically, but I formulated the idea that it was the 614th commandment. And I still believe in that as a major commandment. And what's more, I believe this is certainly heretical from a traditional Jewish, Judaic point of view, but I actually believe that that Jews who have fought hard for the survival and security of Israel are, thereby observing the 614th commandment, are better Jews than some of the, say, the Satmar Hasidim or the Neturei Karta, who observe all 613 but are actually working against the interests of the Jewish state, which they consider a blasphemy. I just, again, a slight digression. The Rav Kook, K-O-O-K, who was chief rabbi of the Yeshuv in Palestine during the 1930s, and who was of course, not only Orthodox, but what today might be called a Haredi. I mean, he was very, very observant. He was an extraordinary man. And he once said about the socialist chalutzim, the socialist pioneers who were coming to Israel and who were militant atheists and who would do provocative things to offend the religious, sort of the equivalent of what socialists in this country used to do. They'd have balls on Yom Kippur. And these guys were very anti-religious, and they made that known. And Rav Kook scandalized his fellow Orthodox Jews in then mandatory Palestine by saying, I kiss the feet of these chalutzim. Without knowing it, they are doing God's work. They don't know, in other words, by building up this state, they are inadvertently doing God's work when they think they're doing something else. And I believe that to be the case of a lot of people who observe the 614th commandment, and those who do not observe it are, in my judgment, whatever else they do, bad Jews.
In the recent commentary symposium, Michael Medved postulated that the only thing that unites all Jews is not being Christian. Thus, Jews are liberal because that is the position most opposed to what they the perceived Christian position on all social issues. What is your opinion on this as an explanation for why Jews are liberals?
Yeah, well, I think Michael Medved has a very good point. I don't agree with him that that's the key explanatory factor, but there is certainly an atavistic fear of Christianity almost built into the Jewish DNA, and Michael, as Michael Medved rightly says, I mean, in some synagogues, anybody is welcome in a synagogue. A Palestinian terrorist, a Buddhist, whatever, but not a Christian. I say not. I mean, I don't entirely buy the theory. I think that what unites, what makes for the liberalism of American Jews is that it has become a religion. Now, I keep saying this over and over again, and in all seriousness, I wrote at least, this book is 100,000 words long, and about 25,000 of those 100,000 are devoted to trying to explain how liberalism has become the religion of American Jews. And I think you can only understand it by tracing the evolution of certain attitudes from the mid-19th century all the way to the present. And I continue to believe that this, because of a historical process that started with the entry of European Jews into the political life of Europe, and that was around the time of the revolutions of 1848, and the influence of Marxism, a lot of different factors, but as I say, I try to trace the evolution of this attitude and how it became a religion in its own right. And that's my answer to the question. But it's an answer that doesn't, I think, resonate when it's stated nakedly in a couple of sentences. I think you need the large context, and that's what I try very hard to supply in this book.
6 or 7 people have asked a variation of this question, so maybe I'll make it the last one so you'll have a chance to sign books for people who want to save. to get them signed. What would it take to convert liberal Jews to conservatives?
An apocalypse. I tell you, you know, the book ends on a more pessimistic note than I ended tonight, partly because I really have begun to see some signs of buyer's remorse. I don't know how serious they are and how long-lasting. But my view is that nothing is forever. And I have lived a fairly long time by now, and in my lifetime I've seen something like 3 major changes in the climate of opinion in this country, at least 2 of them coming out of the blue, unexpectedly. There was a sociologist named Robert Nisbet, who was at the University of California, who once said the most underrated force in human history is boredom. As people wake up one day and say, I'm sick and tired of the ideas I've been, you know, having in my head all these years. Maybe I should try something else. And that's not a frivolous point, but that's one of the forces that does make for change. But generally, big changes of this kind are caused by traumatic events, a war, a depression. When people look around at the realities that they're caught in and they see that the ideas that they have previously believed make sense of life and of the world make no sense any longer, and then they begin to look for other ideas that do make sense. I saw that happening in the 1970s, which was a process that made it possible for the unthinkable to happen, namely the election of a candidate like Ronald Reagan. So I don't give up hope. I mean, the Jews, it says in the Bible that Jews are am kashei oref, a stiff-necked people. No truer words were ever spoken. And the stubbornness is very evident in this intransigent commitment to the Democratic Party and to liberalism. But one can hope that something will begin to open Jewish eyes to the realities in which we are all caught, and it's entirely possible, well, I won't say, I wouldn't bet the ranch on it, that if Obama goes on as he's been going and sort of revealing more and more clearly who he really is, it's entirely possible that a serious disillusion will set in. I wasn't altogether being sardonic when I said he was a kind of non-Jewish Shabtai Tzvi. As for those of you who don't know, Shabtai Tzvi was a false messiah of the 17th century, in which vast numbers of Jews, pious Jews, he believed that he was the Messiah, and he had a huge following. This is a long and fascinating story. When he ended by converting to Islam, which he did, of course, most of his followers were disillusioned. But not all, because some of them, Shabtai Tzvi was a product of that Kabbalistic tradition I was talking about, out of which the idea of Tikkun Olam comes. There were followers of Shabtai Tzvi who desperately searched for rationalizations for this conversion to Islam. And based on the cosmological theory of the Lurianic Kabbalah, they were able to find a reason why his conversion to Islam didn't mean that he wasn't the Messiah. And it was by the way, it was a very ingenious explanation. Some people are hopeless. I mean, they won't. But most of his followers not only had to change their mind about him, they had to change their minds about all the implications that were carried by this figure as a possible Messiah. And deep changes took place in Jewish attitudes throughout Europe and also the Middle East. He was a Sephardic Jew, Shabtai Tzvi. Deep changes took place. For example, there was a radical rebellion against mysticism in the mainstream Jewish community, including among eminent rabbinical authorities who had believed in Shabtai Tzvi. There was a whole wave of new rationalistic philosophy of Judaism. Anyway, I don't want to go into that. I'm simply trying to say that this kind of experience can lead to deep changes, and it's conceivable to me that before Obama is through, he may drive a fair number of Jews out of the liberal camp. If he does, that will be a real achievement. Thanks very much.